Walt, the autonomy markets are taking off like a Ferrari off the start line. News and information is flying around everywhere. Are we getting to the point where perhaps we have to make this 2 shows a week? I'm unsure, but anything's possible. But to our listeners and viewers, we do commit to you every Saturday. Walt and I will continue to break down the autonomy markets. What do you think, Walt? Two, or should we stick with one?
I think to your point, and especially given the earnings week I've just had to deal with, the thought of doing 2 podcasts in a week, in my case, 3, because I already have the Light Shed podcast, I think that would be too much. But you're right. Our listeners can be assured, if you follow me on Twitter, like I say, every Saturday, because that, Grayson, is what you define as a weekly podcast. Not every couple of weeks, every Saturday, we will try and be here dropping episodes for you on the autonomy space.
Perhaps the fourth time's the charm. I do 3 as well, so perhaps fourth. You never know. But what we do know, the news flowed this week. Late in the week, Aurora came out with the big reveal, which we properly called here in Autonomy Markets, that they're going to launch driver-out commercial operations. Earlier in the week, Waymo was on defense. The pivot was real, as we called it last week. They announced, and I'm going to quote this here, a potential strategic relationship with Toyota to develop personally owned autonomous vehicles. Is this a announcement to take some of the heat off of Tesla, or is there something more here?
Well, first, I want to address the pivot, because I think we used the word pivot. We got some feedback on that. Oh, this is not a pivot. This is, they talked about doing private ownership years ago. I mean, when you get to the point where you're announcing a deal or a preliminary agreement with one of the largest OEMs in the country, and the common consensus in the market was, doing robotaxi. The only question was like, is it Waymo 1 or are you partnering with Uber? So to go down this route of private ownership is certainly a pivot and an evolution that I think wasn't really anticipated. So that's huge news. Now, to your point on the preliminary agreement, I mean, preliminary agreement means like there is no formal agreement. And to me, that reflects like we needed to get something in the market. You have Uber's got earnings cup next week. The bigger kind of event that's kind of looming and coming towards us. Tesla launching in June. So maybe these types of things motivated the companies to try and get something in press release.
Reading the tea leaves, Walt, this seemed rushed. And listening over and over and over again to the replays of Alphabet's Q1 earnings call, perhaps Sundar slipped when he made that and they had to accelerate this press release, even though it was not fully baked. Am I reading that right?
I don't know. But I don't know if it feels rushed. It just feels premature. But this is a major strategic decision for the company to make, to indicate to the market that they, in fact, will be willing to license it. I mean, Google stock has not been doing well. You can't blame it on the group at Waymo. You can blame it on the fact that ChatGPT is coming for your search. So I think they need announcements and indicating that you would license the technology, which would be less capital intensive than owning or in some way operating a large robo. Maybe was hopeful of the company to try and get some more positive.
You have to get positive. But I asked this in this week in the Autonomy Economy newsletter. When's the last time you used Google for a query? The results that I got back, not good. Most individuals are using Grok or they're using ChatGPT. When this announcement came, Tesla stock traded down 5%. Are investors now realizing that the Tesla's biggest competitor will be Waymo?
I mean, Tesla stock is so volatile, and every day someone's trying to force a press report about Elon that is oftentimes quickly denied. I mean, I think yesterday they were saying that they were trying to get him out at Tesla, which not only Elon denied, but the board itself denied. So I don't think we can look at Tesla's stock and movement. And also, I would say that management team owner, Elon, is not going to be impacted by their strategic decisions about whether Waymo does something or Aurora does something or whatever. They are plowing forward. They are believers in plans to deliver autonomy to the market. And not for nothing to the Elon haters out there, but when Elon went out and talked about private ownership of Teslas, many people kind of ridiculed that as a crazy idea. So now you effectively have a validation in the market where Waymo and Toyota two respected large brands in the market, are effectively saying that that is our end game here in terms of what they want to accomplish. And then getting back to the very first question again, Grayson, which is, was it premature? Maybe, but if you're just signaling to the market that, hey, we're Google, this is Toyota, we want to get to privately autonomous vehicles, and we're not talking about some random autonomy company. We're talking about Waymo, where people can get into a car today and go to sleep and have true autonomy. That is a momentous occasion, regardless of where they are in the stage of.
True. That's very true. If and when they do sign that potential strategic agreement, does that force a pivot throughout the rest of the industry where you have ramifications that go far and wide?
I mean, I would absolutely. I think that's already happening. I mean, we're seeing announcements, it feels like every other day, which is why you were joking earlier about how to do 2 podcasts a week. I mean, the question I have is Toyota's not new to the game, right? Toyota has a relationship with May Mobility, which we will talk about. They have a relationship with Aurora. And Aurora just had a major milestone, which we will talk about later. Toyota's is deep in this. Where are the other OEMs, and does it put pressure on them? I think it was like Ford that I think backburnered a lot of their autonomous or even their ADAS plans in their car. Should there be, or is there probably in the boardrooms and at the level, a lot of questions being asked about what their future is? Because, if we're talking about autonomous ownership, this is a structural change to the industry. I mean, if you have a car that can drive you on your commute in the morning and then go home and be available for other members of your family, it reduces the number of cars you have to purchase.
It's a game-changing moment on the Ford thing. Pete Bigelow texted me from Automotive News today and said, what's going on? Ford shut down their automotive electrical platform that was built by Doug Field, ex-Apple, shut it down. Their autonomy program is all shut down, which leaves no path for Ford in autonomy but licensing. Does this validate Neuro's pivot to licensing and Wave's business model just to purely focus on licensing? Is this another validation in the market?
I mean, obviously, depending on what your bias is, you could try and use this to validate whatever you want. To me, the primary one is private ownership. In terms of all these other companies, everyone's making decisions, and this is not the only business model that I think can or is going to work. There's advantages and there's disadvantages. It just puts more pressure on perhaps other OEMs to find additional partners. And I think, as we've talked about on this podcast, and as I've written in some recent notes, the key thing to consider is that we haven't seen any exclusivity, right? So it's probable that there's going to be multiple partnerships on both sides, meaning May Mobility using Uber and Lyft, Toyota using multiple technology partners, Uber, using multiple technology partners. So I think everyone's going to want to place their bets. Maybe you have one really strong bet, and then you have others that are at a minimum a stalking horse, but maybe you just don't know which solution is going to win. At the end of the day, and again, we've talked about this on many episodes for our longtime listeners about how AI and what I'm calling autonomy 2.0 and how that's changing the pace and the cost of development.
It's exciting times. You're right. You want to test. But I have to ask this because let's go back in history to 2020. Waymo signed an exclusive deal with Volvo Cars to be the L4 provider. Nothing came of that. That's 5 years. Will Toyota be the same thing in 5 years, or is Waymo really going to get their act together and do something this time?
I mean, I don't know if, first of all, this is exclusive. So I don't think it's exclusive. I guess it could evolve that way, right? It's a preliminary agreement. I don't know. We could go that route. Grayson, the topic I'm more interested in talking about is that, if this is a kind of pivot towards private ownership, is Waymo one as a concept, meaning Google having this massive robotaxi fleet, is that toast now? Is this okay, we have this path on licensing and selling cars, and does this help maybe Uber, become more likely of a partner in whatever markets Google decides to go to? It almost kind of reminds me of Google Fiber. Google Fiber was building fiber to compete with the cable companies in DSL. And when they originally started, it was like, oh my God, Google's going to overbuild everybody and be a competitor. And really all they did was do it in a couple of markets to inspire capital investment, to get regulators to put more pressure on building out fiber. And I think that was ultimately successful. You got fiber building from, AT&T and private equity, and T-Mobile's funding some stuff. So maybe this is kind of a signal that Waymo 1 is really not the long-term strategy for that company. What do you think?
I was involved in a Google Fiber deal back in the day. And I will tell you point blank, it became very obvious to us after a few months that Google Fiber had no interest. They were using us as a bargaining chip. But they did build out Austin. They did build out really Provo, Utah. They built out some really strange markets.
Kansas City. Kansas City was an early one. Yep.
So they built out these strange markets. They commercialized them. But what Waymo 1 is doing, they're building out strategic markets. So I'm unsure. Now I'm going to put the crazy hat on. Do we get to a point where Alphabet perhaps sells Waymo to Uber at some point and merges the Waymo 1 app into Uber?
I mean, that's certainly possible. I wouldn't rule anything out at this point, but that's why this preliminary agreement, I think, is so interesting. It gives you at least a little better insight or a reason to rethink what your preconceived notions may have been about what Google's longer term strategy is. The thing that I've been focused on is getting more cars. So I'm hopeful that when this preliminary agreement continues and discussions continue to get to final point, that part of that is, hey, Toyota, send us some cars that we can either outfit or put on a development timeline to integrate for use, whether it's in our network or if Uber wants to run the network and you have a third party own the network. So sourcing cars, I think, it will be interesting. There was obviously no mention of that. And of course, the relevance of this, as our long-term listeners know, goes back to the unforced error of Waymo of selecting Zeekr, a Chinese EV car manufacturer, which obviously could face some restrictions in terms of even receiving them, let alone how much they're going to cost, given that they're made in China.
As Waymo goes down this pivot, we have public data that says in 2026 they'll begin taking ownership possession of the Hyundai vehicles and they'll be testing them, with more ramping up in 27. Could we potentially see a follow-on release where Hyundai is going to work with Waymo to build a personally owned Ioniq 5 autonomous vehicle?
That is a great question. And if I'm senior management or in charge of that partnership at Hyundai, aren't I getting on the call with Waymo, with Google? I mean, like, what the fuck? Like, I was supposed to be doing, vehicles for you to have in your fleet, and now you're going to be selling cars that are going to compete with me on that side. So absolutely. Like, why would you go through that whole technology integration that Hyundai is doing? And we've seen the cars. We saw them at CES. I think we've seen some cars on Reddit, and not try and benefit from being able to sell those to your customer.
I've been saying this for years. Personally autonomous vehicles are great, but there's a backside to it. How are these vehicles going to be managed? How are they going to be maintained? And how are they going to be insured? What's going to happen? Who's going to manage that whole backside of this?
That's a great question. It's one of the dozen questions that I think comes out of this Waymo and Toyota announcement. That's why it's so monumental. But to your point, like the belief is that Waymo obviously has remote people that when the Waymo gets stuck, they can figure out a way out of that situation. Elon said the same thing about how their cars, when they launch in Austin, are going to work. So if you privately own this, you're going to have to subscribe to something that will deal with the car when they get in those situations. And then on the maintenance, I've been to the depots where Waymos are maintained. There's calibrations that are done, sensors that are cleaned or broken. This provides one of those ecosystem opportunities for someone to make a lot of money in terms of the servicing of these vehicles for that private owner, to either outsource that, or I'm sure there's going to be a DIY opportunity for some consumers as well.
If you look at what your partner Rich covers all the time, it could be a streaming bundle. You get your vehicle subscription, and then you get your cleaning subscription, and you get your insurance subscription powered by Coop. Could we see that?
I pay whatever I pay, $10 for, I think, media in my Tesla. I pay another $99 for autonomous driving. I'm probably going to be able to get discounted insurance rates. So yes, there's multiple different subscriptions that can be attached here, which is great, right? That is a recurring revenue, a high margin business that can get a decent valuation. And in terms of how that industry is serviced, there are companies working very hard today in the background that have this long-term thinking, that are trying to get their, assets in the right locations, and their partnerships with, with Uber, with Lyft, with these companies, with Waymo, to benefit from that over the long term, whether it's private ownership or robotaxis.
You and I have decades of following Marcus. Press releases come, sometimes they're strategic. Was this press release put out for strategic reasons? Was Waymo trying to bring someone to the bargaining table, do a deal, or do something? Was there more to it than meets the eye since it was so vague?
Well, we just talked about the impact we think it would have on Hyundai, but what about the other OEMs that have no partnerships or that are going down a strategic route like Ford that you talked about that is not positive for the rest of the industry? Maybe this is a wake-up call to get them to the table. And maybe the next leak we're going to hear is that Waymo is contemplating some type of exclusivity with Toyota for some version of this, and as well as Hyundai, to get more OEMs. But I think in Google's case, Waymo's case, again, going back to the Google Fiber, if they're trying to affect change in the market to benefit them and their technology, this is to try and get more OEMs to approach them and do a deal like they're contemplating to do with Toyota, because that would obviously be huge for Waymo to sign multiple deals with the OEMs. And by the way, I don't think that Waymo would be able to do an exclusivity, just like I didn't think that they could force the Toyota to only be able to put onto a Waymo One network. Why? Because the FTC is going to say, well, you're using your market power, you're using this great AI intelligence, even though they're a map-focused company, to have an advantage to lock people out of these OEM relationships. So I think that there's still an opportunity for other technology companies to partner with OEM. And maybe for that reason, that's why Toyota was the best choice, because you can't attack Waymo and Toyota. Toyota already has other technology partnerships, versus had they done something with Ford that has none.
You know who's going to be the biggest loser in all this when the pivot comes to fruition? GM. They blinked too early by shutting down Cruise. They're going to be left without an autonomy partner as this market shifts towards person-owned autonomous vehicles. But yet they give Paul Jacobson, their CFO, all this credit. Oh, look, we're increasing the buybacks. Buybacks do not equal innovation. End of the day. It's going to come back to haunt them, and it's going to cost them billions more for that strategic error they made.
Share repurchase and dividends are when you don't have an opportunity to invest for growth. And sometimes investing is just so that you don't decline. And in GM's case, to your point, they have an opportunity to invest for growth. And look, it could be that this agreement makes them pivot again and start to look for more technology partnerships, again, whether it's Nuro or May Mobility or Aurora. I mean, there's a host of opportunities out there for them. Obviously, you're going to face ridicule on this podcast because you're doing it, you're not doing it, you're doing it again. But ultimately, if that's the right decision, I agree with you that share repurchases are probably not the best course of action if you're an auto OEM in this moment in time.
Taking a telco corner here, GM wants to be Verizon. I don't see any other way around it.
At least with Verizon, you could argue that the management team literally doesn't have anything else to invest for in terms of growth. I mean, they tried media, and that was a failure. They are investing, or AT&T is investing in fiber, but in that case, when you have no growth and you've got no opportunity to stimulate your growth, then yeah, give money back to shareholders in the form of dividends or share repurchase.
That's the car side. GM, they've got to figure out before Detroit becomes Foxconn City. But on the autonomous trucking side of the house, we're getting enormous growth. While you had this giant countdown clock going, just like Flava Flav, but it's a Waltz Aurora countdown clock, and you're counting down the days and you were counting down the time and where they're going to do it. And lo and behold, we correctly called it. Furthermore, we correctly called that they were going to launch on the PACCAR Peterbilt truck. Successful drive route commercial operations, and I want to give credit to Chris, Sterling, and Nat, the whole team over there. They didn't just go down, did it once. Over 1,200 fully autonomous miles with nobody in the cab. Aurora, congratulations. You did it. Now the hard work begins. What are your thoughts, Walt?
There was a lot of pressure on this management team, for sure. When we were down at Fort Worth, and you had, just a great group of people representing that industry, there was a lot of focus and optimism for Aurora. I think they from an investor standpoint, I mean, you see the stock's down 5%. Obviously, there's a sell on the news component to this. I wouldn't necessarily have waited to the very last week when you had already delayed things from late 2024 and not announce it till May 1st. I would think it might have looked better if you kind of, hey, of course we were going to do it in April and announce it and do it in mid-April. But look, it's a company and a management team focused on safety and doing it the right way. And if that's when it was done, that's when it was done. And to your point, congrats to them. Okay. But now what's next, right? So this is like, it's always on to the next, right? This is a great accomplishment, but now investors want to feel like, what's our next path? What's our next catalyst that gives them confidence that they can convert this into a revenue, EBITDA, and free cash flow generating machine that can justify the valuation of the company.
There are business review calls coming up on May 8th. Do we get any insight on that call for what's next?
If possible, I don't expect anything more other than to reiterate that, look, hey, we want to work on, doing it in all these weather conditions, which doesn't seem like that should be a heavy lift. I don't think people are going to get too excited. Like, oh, great, you can drive in the rain. Getting tens of trucks, if there's any way to increase that to more. Again, I know you're focused on PACCAR. That was a great call. We had great conversations with Volvo. I am personally interested in how that Volvo relationship and when that Volvo relationship will evolve. For sure, I don't know if the market in general cares about that level of weeds, I guess I would call it, in the company. But, and I think maybe getting a better sense of the revenue model and seeing some revenue ramp is going to be very important.
And I need to highlight this because it's really important. We talked about it on past episodes. Continental and that extremely valuable deal that Aurora cut played a huge role in making this happen. And Continental deserves a lot of the credit for making this milestone possible. The launch partner for Aurora was Uber Freight. Olivia Hu, really, really well done. Congratulations. Well, you and I have talked about this offline quite a bit. The market doesn't give Uber credit for the Uber Freight business. They report May 7th. Does Dara make a statement about this and how they're going to grow the Uber Freight business?
Dara's given himself a lot of things to talk about on this earnings call. Yeah, I think that's going to be one of it. Dara used to be on the board of this company. They own, what is it, like 28% of the company. This is where the Uber ATG guys go, which in some way was Dara kind of pushing out like the Travis era stuff. But still, this is a close partner for Uber. So absolutely, it's going to be profiled. I mean, Uber Freight is a smaller percentage of the overall business for sure. And hopefully, I don't think he'll do this, but hopefully maybe Dara will talk about, the broader opportunity that could benefit Uber even more greatly, which is the fact that Aurora's got a Toyota relationship themselves, where they plan to integrate their Aurora driver into Toyota Siennas that can be then used, in the Uber fleet. So I hope Dara talks about that. I don't know if he will. If I get a question on the call, I will ask it.
Okay. To the Uber folks that listen, please let Paul ask a question because we know you listen. So that's my pitch. Well, the autonomous trucking market's heating up. Kodiak's in the process of going public. This week, Plus put out video. They were testing on a track, fully driver out autonomous, preparing for their 2027 launch. Are we getting at an inflection point for autonomous trucking here?
I mean, this definitely increases the profile. I can just tell you from the investor standpoint, just these announcements this week, the dialogue in terms of who are these companies again, and we're going to have an opportunity to meet with Don Burnett from Kodiak and the Plus AI guys in a couple of weeks when they're in New York. I think there has to be more investor knowledge in investigating the size of the trucking market because it is huge. It doesn't go without saying what I said before, though, that, autonomy technology can expand to other vehicles. Like if you're getting it to work, and you can make it work on a Class 8 gigantic truck to work on a highway. Think about that, the speed and the weight that thing's traveling, and the ability to kind of pivot and do cars. I mean, you would think that there's some applicability. So that was a long answer for your question. The short answer is absolutely. And hopefully the timing is good for Kodiak, who's, in the process of doing a SPAC transaction to go public to raise incremental capital.
Right now, Aurora's driver out, public roads. Kodiak is driver out in the Permian Basin, and later this year, Bot Auto looks all signs point to them being the third one to join them for driver out. It's a very big milestone. It seems that towards the end of this year into 2027, there's going to be a lot of movement coming in the autonomous trucking industry.
Again, you're going back to our primary theme. This is the common theme. We're going to have to go to 2 times a week. Yeah, we're just, Grayson, you and I are, and especially, the great people in Fort Worth that hosted us, certainly very optimistic about the market opportunity that can exist there. And helps out companies like JB Hunt, where great people there that we've spoken with, as well as, Amazon, UPS, the entire ecosystem there. It's a big opportunity.
Autonomy is an ecosystem. Going back to the car side and going to Uber, Uber is building out an autonomy ecosystem. Dara deserves a ton of credit for executing on an autonomy strategy of building that fragmentation. And just today, right before we recorded, you sent a WhatsApp. You go, boom! We called it. We did call. We went on a pretty good call in it roll here, I got to say.
It's not we, Grayson. It's not we. It's you called this one in terms of adding Uber to the mix for May Mobility.
That's very kind of you. Well, we're still a team, so we called it. May Mobility is now going to be operating on the Uber network starting in Arlington, Texas later this year. Ed, proud of you, buddy. Well done. We visited you in Ann Arbor in March, Walt and I. And then when we were in Texas, well, I'm going to let Walt take this over now. He went and checked you out in Arlington, Texas, where you're going to deploy. What did you learn when you were down in Arlington, Walt?
So Arlington is, I think that's a state or someone federal government basically pays one ticket price for the contract and they run it, and the students were getting it for free. It wasn't the same hardware and software that we experienced in Ann Arbor. So what I suspect is that, when they convert those cars and drivers and those operations effectively to Uber, you'll probably get some hardware and software updates there to make it more consistent with the experience that both of us had in Ann Arbor. And to be clear to our listeners, we sat in a car and there was no one in the driver's seat and it drove around Ann Arbor. So that was driver out, obviously not taking paid rides. I should have given him $1 and said, here's your first paid ride. So Arlington, I think, is just they're picking up on an existing contract. But the bigger issue is it shows how a technology company, can have multiple rideshare partners, and that's fine for both of those companies. I'm sure Uber and Lyft don't care. Like, they want technology companies like May Mobility to succeed. So there's no downside, I don't think, for them to both be using them, perhaps in different markets.
Toyota's an investor in May Mobility. They have a manufacturing partnership. They're building them custom Toyota Sienna minivans. And I want to highlight, because there's some very interesting language in the Uber press release here. It said May will be putting on the platform American-made hybrid electric Toyota Sienna Autonomy mass vehicles. The keyword American-made. Is this Uber and May understanding tariffs, or is this Uber signaling to the market they understand that Waymo's in trouble with the Seeker?
I think that's just underscoring stuff that's important in the current environment. I'm not sure that was a key driver of the deal, but you play to your strengths. But look, the important thing here is, as you pointed out, is the relationship that Toyota already has with May, where they have a roadmap to go from what is currently the Waymo type model, where you're getting a car and then outfitting it with your tech stack, to having it come off the manufacturing line. And that's a relationship that exists and that will, if they're successful and continue, occur with those things coming off the line in Ohio at some point. So that speaks to scale. And most importantly, that speaks to price. So for all those people out there that constantly Waymo can't, or the Waymo car is too expensive, because you're looking at the current state, car with electronics put on top. Now the electronics get cheaper. It gets integrated at the manufacturing plant. That's going to cut the cost of those cars dramatically and obviously improve the return dynamics. And then most importantly, look, May Mobility is in the middle of a Series E capital raise. What a great time for an announcement with a partner like Uber to be able to kind of, add more capital into that raise and get this company going. You joke about Ed Olson, little engine they could. Little engine they could. I know that's your joke, but this is, they've done a lot with not a lot of money. And, this is going to help to really, I think, buttress them forward.
They've done a lot, but I'm going to highlight and emphasize this. They've gone driver out. We were both in the vehicle. There was no driver. There was no remote driver. There was no teleops. It was full driver out. They did it. They accomplished it. And here's another thing. They can do it in the snow. Doesn't have to be a perfect day. That's a big, huge accomplishment.
I agree. But I will say this. Let's flip this to Tesla, which has not done driver out yet officially. I use my FSD 12.6, not 13. As our longtime listeners know, I don't have the most recent hardware in dense fog, and it works. And I know Elon was asked about this in the last call and talked about, I don't know whether it was him or one of his compatriots, talked about how the cameras work in dense fog. I think investors maybe have gotten too overly concerned about the variety of weather conditions restricting whether this industry can move forward. Clearly, they're doing it at Kodiak. They're definitely doing it at May Mobility. And Grayson, I'm sure you've been on other visits with other companies that have similarly achieved this milestone.
Bad weather, the vehicles are doing it. Waymo can drive in snow. They can drive in 100-degree heat in the desert in California. The interesting thing about the timing of this deal with May Mobility, they've been very public that they're gearing up, and Curtis Hodge is doing a great job building up May Mobility to launch on the Lyft platform in Atlanta later this year. I'll go on and probably say by the summer. Now you've got an Uber relationship, and when David Risher does an interview, he did one last week on CNBC, he wouldn't even say the word Uber. It was like a dirty word. What impact is this going to have on May's deal with Lyft?
Obviously, it's positive, right? Because it reduces the risk when you have another partner out there that's helping to drive revenue and cash flow, for that company. So I think that's a positive. I guess maybe you'd be concerned that there'd be a struggle over, who's going to get access to the cars that are coming off the line. But given this Toyota relationship and what we've heard from May Mobility, these guys expect to have tens of thousands of cars on the road by 2029. With that said, there are practical considerations that have to be made, meaning like if you only have a certain number of cars, that maybe you just restrict it on a market by market basis, meaning I do Atlanta with Lyft, Arlington with Uber, and flip them back and forth, and then ultimately evolve it to allow them both to operate in the same market. So how do you think that plays out?
I think you're going to get to the point where certain markets are exclusive. So Lyft has the Atlanta market with May Mobility. Perhaps the Nashville market is with Uber, and then perhaps the Denver markets with Lyft, and then the LA markets with Uber. That very well could happen. Otherwise, they're just competing against themselves. And it goes back to the early days of rideshare where a driver operated for both services, and we saw the tensions that were there. I think it's something that we're going to have to learn, and we're going to have to see how it evolves. And when we look at this technology evolving, the great highway unlock is coming. When you and I visited May, we saw they're preparing to go on highways. This week, there were several photos popping up on Reddit where Waymo is now testing on the highways outside of Nashville. They're testing on I-95, which I call Mario Kart land in Miami, because people know one speed, fast and faster, two speeds actually. And then we had on an I-80 in San Francisco in the Bay Area, we had a Zeekr testing on the highway. When do you think this highway lock's coming? Because based on all the photos that we're seeing, Waymo appears to be ramping up testing.
I can't even remember what my initial prediction what it was on this, but whatever it was, I'm moving it up. And I'll use as my first evidence the fact that they just put out a preliminary agreement with Toyota, which is reflective, I think, of the pressure that they're feeling to get announcements and move the technology forward. So, I don't know. Like, first of all, where are they on the timing, do you think, with the airports? And let's assume that for whatever reason they can't get an airport drop-off area. Do they wait for that before they do highways, or just push forward with highways?
They push forward with highways. Right now, the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport in Arizona, you can pick up curbside in a Waymo. That's fully operational. I believe in California, and when I say the airports, it's going to be San Jose, LAX, SFO. By the end of the year, highway unlock will come this summer. We had a report in Politico today that Waymo has gotten permission to test in Emeryville, California, which is in the East Bay. The interesting connection there, I-80 is the road that connects San Francisco to the East Bay. So, and that's a highway. So perhaps Waymo's really gearing up for a larger expansion in California that highways will unlock.
Yeah, I wonder in some cases if they have these islands of city coverage like they do right now between San Fran and further down the valley, whether you just use the highways as a way to connect the two. It's almost kind of like cell phone companies. This is always my example, where they'll light up the highways through rural America. And then if there's a population, then they can build out some additional cell sites there. That would seem to make sense. But more importantly, I look at it even within market, Grayson, and I'll go back to the experience that I had in LA when I was there checking out the many depots that Waymo had. A 45-minute trip within LA could have been 20 minutes if they were able to hop on that. What is it, the 5 there, in Santa Monica? So even that's just going to improve the performance of their vehicles within market.
The freeway was the 10, and the Santa Monica Freeway. They need to unlock that. They need to unlock the 101, and they need to unlock the 405. We have proof. Will Coleman, the CEO of Alto, he shared a photo of Waymo testing on the 405 down by the airport. It's going to connect communities. We do know Waymo is ramping up. They're scaling up fast. We have unconfirmed reports of 1,000 plus Jaguar I-Paces at a Magna factory in Arizona getting ready to be upfitted. Are we getting to the point in the San Francisco Bay Area where the only company that will be able to compete in robotaxi with them will be Tesla? Is Waymo getting that far ahead of the market?
No, they aren't, because I think there's a lot of these other technology companies that we talk about every week that are doing partnerships that are fast followers and perhaps able to leapfrog them based on the technologies that they're using and the scrappiness of their management teams.
It comes down to management teams, and I have to ask this. Where's Zooks? Why are we not hearing about it?
I mean, we used to plug it in because there'd be some information. I know there was something I saw on LinkedIn and in Zooks this week down in your neck of the woods. Yeah, I don't know, man. Zooks is certainly a head scratcher, and certainly someone that has, emphasized that they had a do it alone strategy, which now looks quite different based on all of the partnerships that we've seen in this week alone.
The market's changing. We're going to learn a lot next week. We got Aurora's earnings call. We have Uber's earnings call. What else do we need to look for in the autonomy markets over the next week, Walt?
Well, you just stole my thunder. It's earnings week. I had a lot of earnings this week, a lot. Next week, you're right. Uber, Aurora, Lyft, a couple others for me in the TMT space. So it'll be another busy week, and who knows? Maybe we get freeways unlocked by Waymo.
At the rate information is coming out of Waymo, you never know what we're going to get, but we do know the autonomy markets will keep on driving autonomously. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is driver out. Walt, until next week.